The night was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, muffling the world outside. Highway 31, just outside Birmingham, Alabama, stretched out under a sky bruised with clouds, the wet pavement reflecting the occasional headlights of passing cars. It was July 7th, 2025, just past 11 p.m., and Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson was behind the wheel of her modest sedan, driving home after a long day. Her fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel, keeping time with an old jazz tune spilling softly from the speakers. The melody was a familiar comfort, a reminder of evenings spent with her father, who taught her to love the smooth, soulful notes of Coltrane and Davis. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. To anyone glancing her way, she was just another driver, unremarkable, blending into the night. Renee had been on the road for nearly 2 hours, her mind drifting between the day's meetings and the promise of a warm bed. She was a Navy officer, a graduate of the Naval Academy with a distinguished career, multiple commendations, deployments overseas, and a reputation for keeping her cool under pressure. But tonight, she was tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from carrying the weight of responsibility for too long. The road was nearly empty, save for a few cars rolling past, their headlights bouncing off the slick asphalt. The streetlights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. Then she saw it in her rearview mirror, red and blue lights flashing with an urgency that made her stomach clench. Not fear, she'd faced worse than a traffic stop in her years of service, but a weary resignation. She knew how these things could go. Renee signaled, eased her car onto the shoulder, and put it in park. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her hands resting visibly on the wheel. Military training had drilled into her the importance of staying calm, of keeping your hands where they could be seen. She'd been through this before, not just as a civilian, but as a black woman in a world that often saw her as a threat before it saw her as a person. The white patrol car stopped just behind her, its lights painting the night in stark, pulsing colors. The officer took his time getting out, his silhouette looming in her side mirror. When he finally stepped onto the asphalt, his heavy boots scuffed against the ground, deliberate, like a man who expected the world to bend to his will. One hand rested on his belt near his holster, the other held a flashlight that flicked on as he approached, its beam cutting through the darkness. Renee turned her head slightly, catching the glint of his badge in the light. Briggs. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat, practiced, impatient. No greeting, no explanation, just a command. Renee met his eyes in the mirror, her expression neutral but steady. She reached slowly into the glove compartment, pulling out her documents with the care of someone who knew one wrong move could escalate things. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a once-over, his flashlight lingering on the rear bumper. "Tail lights out," he said finally, his tone clipped. Renee frowned. That can't be right. She knew her car. She was meticulous about maintenance, a habit born from years of military discipline. They were checked a few weeks ago. Briggs looked at her then, his eyes narrowing. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed, heavy with unspoken tension. Renee felt it, the shift in the air, that quiet moment where power met resistance and one side expected the other to cave. She'd seen it before, not just on the streets but in briefings, on bases overseas, in training exercises designed to prepare sailors for the world outside the Navy. She knew better than to push too hard, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, her voice still calm. "My tail lights were checked recently, but if there's an issue, I can get it fixed." "Step out of the car," Briggs cut her off, his tone sharp, like he hadn't heard a word she'd said. Renee exhaled slowly, her eyes flicking toward the empty road ahead. No witnesses, just the flicker of streetlights and the hum of her car's engine. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" she asked, keeping her voice even. Briggs tilted his head, a smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "Because I said so." She let that hang in the air for a second, the weight of his words sinking in. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected, carrying the faint scent of rain. She stepped onto the pavement, her posture relaxed but measured. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. She could feel him sizing her up, deciding how much he could get away with. "Turn around, hands on the car," he ordered. This time she hesitated. For what reason? His smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of annoyance. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground, her eyes locked on his. "No, I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, amusement, maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker, his eyes never leaving hers. Then louder, "Turn around." Her pulse picked up, but her expression stayed neutral. "Officer," she said, her voice low but firm, "I need you to understand something. I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tensed, his hand dropping to the cuffs on his belt. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest for what?" "For obstructing an officer," he said, his voice cold as he pulled out the cuffs. She exhaled sharply through her nose. So that was his game. Her military training kicked in, heartbeat steady, breathing even. She had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms, grounding her. Briggs wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back and snapping the cuffs on far too tightly. The metal bit into her wrists, a deliberate act of control. He shoved her toward the patrol car, his hand heavy on her shoulder. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Briggs chuckled, shoving her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't, not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back as Renee sat still, her wrists burning against the too tight cuffs. The door slammed shut, sealing her in. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. She glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat, catching the faint reflection of her face, calm, composed, but beneath it, something simmered. She'd been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. This was different, though. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. Minutes passed. 5, then 10. She shifted her hands slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight, just as she'd expected. He'd done it on purpose, a petty power play. The driver's side door swung open, and Briggs slid in, whistling a tuneless melody. "Well, well," he muttered, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's take a little ride." She didn't respond. He threw the car into gear, pulling off the shoulder and back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, its overhead lights still flashing, painting the road behind them in red and blue. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, his voice casual but laced with condescension, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She looked at him through the glass partition. "I don't think, I know." That made him pause just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the steering wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug exterior. But he covered it quickly. "You military?" he asked, his tone shifting, probing. She didn't answer. "Yeah, I figured," he went on, smirking again. "You got that attitude, that above-the-law type. Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, she stayed silent. Briggs clicked his tongue. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tightened. The audacity of it, as if his actions were somehow her fault. The station came into view up ahead, a squat grey brick building just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty, late-night processing was slow, and for now it looked like she was the only guest. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, "I do love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Renee twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out, the cuffs biting into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past a bored-looking desk sergeant, and into processing. The holding area smelled like old coffee and sweat, a metal bench lining the far wall, a steel door leading to the cells just beyond it. Briggs uncuffed her just long enough to push her through booking, fingerprints, mug shot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions. She'd seen this kind of indifference before, the kind that let men like Briggs thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. She glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. "Enjoy your stay," Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Renee caught herself before she stumbled, turning to watch as the metal bars slid shut between them. Briggs smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. Renee took a slow breath, then sank onto the bench, the chill of the metal pressing through her jeans, grounding her. One night. That's all it would take, because Briggs had no idea who he'd just messed with. The cell was a small, stark box, 4 concrete walls, a single flickering fluorescent light, and the faint, lingering smell of old sweat and disinfectant. Renee shifted on the metal bench, rolling her shoulders to ease the stiffness creeping in. The cold seeped through her jeans, a sharp contrast to the warmth of her car just an hour ago. She'd spent nights in worse conditions. Desert outposts with sand in her boots, cramped bunks on a rocking ship, interrogation rooms in places where the threat wasn't just discomfort, but real, tangible danger. This was nothing by comparison. But that didn't mean she wasn't angry. Through the bars, she could hear the faint murmur of officers at the front desk, the occasional shuffle of paperwork, the clatter of a coffee cup against a desk. She exhaled slowly, deliberately. Control the breathing, control the mind. It was a mantra drilled into her during basic training, long before she'd climbed the ranks to lieutenant commander. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sounds of the station fade into the background, focusing on the steady rhythm of her own breath. Then she heard it. The heavy, deliberate footsteps. Briggs. She knew it was him before he even came into view, his stride carrying that same arrogant rhythm, like a man who thought he owned the world. He appeared in front of the cell a second later, arms crossed over his chest, that same infuriating smirk plastered on his face. "Comfy?" he asked, his tone dripping with mockery. Renee didn't answer, just met his gaze with a steady, unyielding stare. He tilted his head, stepping closer to the bars. "You know, if you'd just played along, you wouldn't be in here right now." She let a slow smile curl at the edges of her lips. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be." His smirk faltered, just for a second, a flicker of something in his eyes. Annoyance, uncertainty. He covered it fast, scoffing as he glanced toward the empty holding area. "No one's coming to get you tonight, lady," he said, shrugging. "Guess that means you'll have some time to think about that attitude." Renee just watched him, unmoved, unshaken. Briggs leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "See, here's the thing," he continued. "People like you think the rules don't apply. You think a little confidence is enough to get you out of trouble." She let him talk, let him ramble. It didn't matter what he said, because he didn't know what was coming. And then, as if on cue, another officer approached from the hallway, a younger man, probably in his late 20s, dressed in a standard-issue uniform. He stopped a few feet away, holding a clipboard, his posture hesitant. Sergeant," The officer's voice carried a hint of uncertainty. Briggs barely glanced at him. "What?" The officer shifted on his feet, glancing down at the clipboard. "We got a call. I think you need to see this." Briggs frowned, then gave Renee one last look before stepping away. She sat back, listening. The conversation was hushed, but she caught fragments, something about a lawyer, a call from higher up, questions about why she was being held. Briggs's voice dropped lower, sharp and annoyed. The younger officer stammered something in response, but whatever it was, it didn't seem to make Briggs happy. Then the heavy footsteps returned. Briggs stormed back, his jaw tight, hands clenched into fists at his sides. His smirk was gone. "What the hell did you do?" he demanded, his voice low but seething. Renee leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees, her expression calm but her eyes sharp. "I didn't do anything," she said, tilting her head slightly. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." Briggs's face darkened. She could see it now, the moment of realization creeping in, the shift in power. He wasn't in control anymore. He turned on his heel, muttering something under his breath, and disappeared down the hallway. Renee exhaled, settling back against the wall. It wouldn't be long now. She closed her eyes again, letting her mind drift to the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who'd ever been pulled over for no reason, cuffed for asking a question, locked up for daring to exist in a world that didn't always see them as human. She'd known from the moment Briggs's lights flashed in her rearview mirror that this wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a test, and she wasn't about to fail. The hours ticked by, slow and heavy. The station grew quieter as the night deepened, the murmurs at the front desk fading to a low hum. Renee didn't sleep. She didn't need to. Her mind was too sharp, too focused. She thought about her career, about the years she'd spent proving herself in rooms where she was the only woman, the only black person, the only one who had to work twice as hard to be seen as half as good. She thought about her father, who told her stories of his own encounters with men like Briggs, men who saw a black face and assumed they could do whatever they wanted. She thought about the people who didn't have her rank, her training, her resources, people who faced this kind of injustice and had no way to fight back. The sound of footsteps broke her thoughts. Lighter this time, not Briggs. The young officer from earlier appeared at the bars, his expression nervous but professional. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson?" he said, his voice low. She nodded, sitting up straighter. "That's me." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at her. "Your attorney's here. You're being released." Renee didn't smile, didn't show any sign of relief. She just stood, brushing off her jeans, her movements calm and deliberate. The officer unlocked the cell, the bars sliding open with a heavy clang. She stepped out, her posture straight, her eyes forward. The officer led her back to the front desk, where a woman in a sharp blazer stood waiting. Carla Whitman, her attorney. Carla was all business, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes scanning a stack of papers in her hand. She barely glanced up as Renee approached. "Let's go," Carla said, her voice clipped but not unkind. "We've got a lot to do." Renee nodded, falling into step beside her. As they walked out of the station, the cool night air hit her face, a sharp contrast to the stale smell of the holding cell. She took a deep breath, letting it fill her lungs. The fight wasn't over, not yet. But she was out, and she was ready. Morning light spilled through the narrow windows of the Birmingham courthouse, casting long streaks across the polished wooden floors. The air inside was crisp, the kind of cold that settled deep in your bones if you sat still too long. Renee stood near the defendant's table, her posture relaxed, but her eyes sharp. She wasn't in handcuffs anymore, no orange jumpsuit, no holding cell. She wore a well-tailored navy blue blazer, a simple blouse, and an undeniable presence that filled the room without effort. Beside her, Carla Whitman flipped through a stack of papers, her movements efficient, methodical, no wasted energy. The attorney didn't bother with small talk, and Renee appreciated that. They were here for one thing: justice. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and Sergeant Daniel Briggs walked in. He still carried himself like he owned the room, shoulders squared, chin slightly lifted, but there was a difference now, a stiffness in his step, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression that hadn't been there the night before. He wasn't as sure of himself anymore. Renee caught his eye for a brief moment, and he looked away. Good. The judge entered, and the room quieted. Judge Alan Kirkland, an older man with a weary expression, adjusted his glasses as he settled into his chair. He didn't waste time. "All right," he sighed, glancing over the case files. "Let's get to it." The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, we have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson, was unlawfully detained without probable cause. Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Daniel Briggs." A murmur rippled through the room. Briggs shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. The judge peered at him over his glasses. "Sergeant Briggs, care to explain?" Briggs leaned forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, the defendant was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop." "Uncooperative?" The prosecutor cut him off, lifting a document from the table. "Lieutenant Commander Dawson's record shows a distinguished military career, graduate of the Naval Academy, multiple commendations, no criminal history, no outstanding citations. Are you telling me that despite all this, she was such a threat that you had to arrest her over a broken taillight?" Briggs opened his mouth, then shut it. The silence stretched, heavy and damning. The prosecutor continued, flipping through his papers. "Additionally, an internal review of your arrest history shows a disproportionate number of traffic stops involving black drivers in this district." The murmurs grew louder. Briggs's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Judge Kirkland set his file down with a sigh. "Sergeant, I don't like what I'm hearing." Briggs sat back, crossing his arms. "She resisted." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow. "The body cam footage says otherwise." Another ripple of noise moved through the room. Briggs looked at the judge, suddenly more defensive. "I was following standard procedure." Judge Kirkland wasn't buying it. He glanced toward the bailiff. "Let's play the footage." A screen lowered at the front of the courtroom, and the video began to play. Renee didn't turn to watch. She'd lived it. Briggs barking orders, her calm voice, the unnecessary escalation, the smug way he tightened the cuffs. The room was dead silent when the footage ended. Judge Kirkland leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs, you violated protocol. You conducted an unlawful arrest, and you failed to report the full details in your initial statement." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "The charges against Lieutenant Commander Dawson are hereby dismissed." His gavel came down, sharp and final. "And I strongly suggest an internal investigation into Sergeant Briggs's conduct." The tension in the room snapped like a pulled rubber band. Briggs looked like he'd been punched in the gut, his face flushed red, hands clenched into fists. Renee exhaled slowly, controlled. She never had a doubt. As she stood, collecting her things, she glanced toward Briggs one last time. Their eyes met, no words exchanged, they didn't need to be. This time, she wasn't the one who had to fight for her reputation. Briggs was. Briggs stormed out of the courtroom, his heavy footsteps echoing down the polished hallways. He could feel the eyes on him, other officers, court staff, even reporters who'd shown up after word of the case spread. He wasn't used to this. He was used to control, to walking into a room and commanding respect or fear. But now, the power he'd taken for granted felt like it was slipping through his fingers. "Sergeant Briggs!" A sharp voice cut through the hallway noise. He turned to see Chief Eldon Baker standing with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The older man had been on the force for over 30 years, a respected figure whose word carried weight. Briggs straightened. "Sir." Baker studied him for a moment, then motioned for Briggs to follow him into a private office. The second the door shut, the chief's tone dropped. "What the hell were you thinking?" Briggs exhaled sharply. "I was doing my job." "Your job?" Baker scoffed, tossing a file onto the desk. It landed with a heavy thud. That's not what it looks like from here. The body cam footage, the arrest history, the fact that you didn't even know who you were arresting. Briggs's nostrils flared. What does that have to do with anything? Everything, Baker said, leaning forward, his voice quiet but sharp. This wasn't some random woman. This was a high-ranking Navy officer. You think this is just going to disappear? Briggs looked away, grinding his teeth. She was disrespectful. She questioned you, Baker cut in. That's not a crime. Briggs scoffed, shaking his head. You don't get it. People like that. People like what? Baker's expression hardened. Briggs swallowed but said nothing. Baker sighed, rubbing his forehead. The DA is reviewing every single one of your cases from the past 5 years. You've been flagged for racial profiling, and you better believe this department isn't going down with you. Briggs felt his stomach twist. What does that mean? It means you're being put on immediate suspension, effective now, Baker said. Internal Affairs is investigating, and if they find what I think they're going to find, your career is over. The words hit Briggs like a punch to the gut. His face burned. This is bull. Don't finish that sentence, Baker said, his voice ice. Pack up your desk, and if I were you, I'd get a lawyer. Briggs stood there, fists at his sides, his world unraveling in real time. For the first time in his career, he realized he wasn't untouchable. Across town, Renee sat in a quiet cafe, stirring a cup of coffee as she scrolled through her phone. The case had already made headlines. Lieutenant Commander wrongfully arrested, officer under investigation. The body cam footage had gone viral, shared across platforms like X, sparking outrage and calls for reform. She wasn't surprised. She'd known from the second she stepped out of her car that this could be bigger than her, bigger than Briggs. She'd seen men like him before, entitled, arrogant, used to bending the law in their favor. But this time, he'd lost. Her phone buzzed with a message from Carla. Briggs has been suspended, might face charges. Renee took a slow sip of her coffee. Good. She glanced out the window, watching the city move on around her. The afternoon air carried the scent of fresh rain, and the streets were alive with people going about their day. Her phone buzzed again, this time a familiar number. She sighed, then answered. "Captain," she greeted. "Lieutenant Commander," the familiar voice replied. "I assume you've seen the news." "I have." A brief silence, then, "And how are you feeling?" Renee glanced at her reflection in a nearby storefront window. No signs of defeat, no cracks in her composure. "I feel like I did exactly what I was supposed to do." The captain's voice softened. "That's what I thought you'd say." A pause. "The Department of Defense has taken interest in your case. Don't be surprised if they ask you to speak on it." Renee exhaled through her nose. "Not sure I'm interested in being a headline." "You already are," the captain countered. "And whether you like it or not, what happened to you is a reflection of something bigger." She knew that. She'd always known that Briggs wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for years. This wasn't just about her, it was about the dozens, maybe hundreds of people who'd been in her shoes but didn't have the rank, the legal team, or the voice to fight back. Renee leaned against a streetlight, watching the traffic move by. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," she said, "and it won't be the last." "No," the captain agreed, "but it's the first time Briggs is facing consequences, and it's because you didn't back down." Renee closed her eyes for a second, letting those words settle. She hadn't backed down, not when Briggs pulled her over, not when he tried to intimidate her, not when the cuffs tightened around her wrists, not even when she spent the night behind bars, knowing the deck was stacked against her. She'd stayed firm, and now she'd won. The captain cleared his throat. "One last thing," he added. "You might be getting a call from the mayor's office. Seems they want to recognize you for handling the situation with professionalism and grace." Renee smirked. "Now that's ironic." The captain chuckled. "You gonna accept it?" She thought for a moment, then shrugged. "I'll think about it." She ended the call and tucked her phone back into her pocket. Across the street, a mother walked with her young son, his small hand wrapped tightly around hers. He was laughing, carefree, full of life. Renee watched them for a moment, her heart tightening. The next generation. She'd fought for herself, yes, but she'd also fought for him. For every black boy and girl who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Briggs couldn't wield their badges like weapons. She took a deep breath and walked away, her steps firm, her purpose clear. The fight wasn't just hers, it never had been. Power unchecked is power abused, and the only way to change the system was to hold it accountable. What happened to her happened to people every day. People without the privilege of rank, connections, or evidence to back them up. That's why she'd keep speaking up, keep demanding change, keep refusing to stay silent, because real change started with real conversations, and she was just getting started. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it with others so they can learn something from it too.